So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Terry Swartz-Russell. I am the co-chair of adult learning at Temple Amuna. And along with Sandy, where are you? There she is, Sandy Goldstein. And we partner for tonight's program with Hartman, Boston, with Temple Isaiah. And our co-chair, Wendy Lebo, is not here, but we thank her. And for all those out in Zoom world, which we hope is working, welcome as well. It's a great pleasure for our synagogues to come together, Temple Isaiah and Temple Amuna, to bring Hartman Boston to our community and provide opportunities to Boston Jewry for learning with outstanding scholars. Our shuls have a long-standing history of studying together, especially through the Lexington Jewish Institute of Jewish Studies. Okay, I'll get that, right? Which there's an amazing series coming up, by the way. And you'll hear more about it. And we're thrilled that Hartman gives us an opportunity to come together. I think that's about it. Lastly, our partner at Hartman Boston is Rabbi Emily Goldberg Weiner. Okay. I should just read the sheet that I have. She's the manager of Boston for Hartman, Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and director of spiritual engagement at Beth Shalom of Providence, Rhode Island. She received her ordination from Yeshivat Maharat in Riverdale, New York. And Emily lives in Boston with her husband, Jonah, who's the campus rabbi at Tufts. And I'll add their extroverted golden retriever, Barley. It always helps if you've introduced her before, so now you know more about her. And Emily's going to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you all so much for coming out in what I'm learning is Boston winter, which isn't so bad. Everyone's saying, just you wait. I'm actually from Florida, so anything that's north of Florida is frigid and frozen tundra. So it is really exciting to be here as we are launching our presence in the Boston region. My name's Emily Goldberg Weiner. I haven't figured out which last name I'm keeping and which one I'm dropping, so I'm holding on to both of them for now. And I recently took on this position thanks to a grant from the Combined Jewish Philanthropies. The Hartman Institute is able to have a presence in the regional hub in Boston, which is extremely exciting. We are working to partner with different synagogues and communities in the area. And if you want us in your community, I'm the person to call. Happy to give you any business cards or take you to coffee and hear about your Jewish journey. We are so grateful not only to Temples Isaiah and Amuna for opening their doors to us, but specifically Terry Swartz-Russell and Wendy Lebo, who can't be here right now. If you want to give them a task and have everything ready to go, give them 5 minutes. They're just coming back from a walk together, and they'll set up shop, invite all these people, and have exciting Torah learning happening in your community. Together, they can accomplish all kinds of things, and it's been truly a joy and a pleasure to partner with them in making this happen. I also want to thank Gila Axelrod, my associate here at Hartman in Boston. She's right over there in the second row. And I also know that the more suburban we get in the Boston region, the more I feel the presence of Hebrew College in Boston as the pioneers of all the Jewish learning that we've been able to humbly follow in the footsteps of. So I know there's a lot of Hebrew College representatives here. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this evening. I feel like I've actually memorized this bio at this point, but I'm still going to read from it just to make sure I got this right. Rabbi Justin Pine serves as the Director of Lay Leadership for the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He shapes the educational vision for lay leaders, seeking to deepen the Institute's impact as well as their own. Previously at Hartman, he served as the Director of Youth and Young Adult Initiatives, leading all programming for day school and camping leaders as well as teens. Prior to joining Hartman, he served as the Senior Fellow at the J.J. Greenberg Institute for the Advancement of Jewish Life, who you'll hear about this evening, where he worked closely with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg on a variety of writing and programming projects, including a translation and a commentary of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's Or Yisrael. He also served as the Director of Character Development, the Mashgiach Ruchani, at the Ramaz Middle School on the Upper East Side. where he developed and implemented character development, or Musar, which I know is really popular in Boston, programming for parents, faculty, students, and leadership. Most importantly, he is the grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors, and he is very passionate about sharing their stories in everything that he does. He received his bachelor's in communications from UPenn, his JD from Harvard Law School. He did Wexner, he did the APAC LaFell Fellowship, the JGGI Fellowship. I can't finish all these things in one breath. And he received his rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva Chovevei Torah and practiced corporate law at Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Justin and his family, he also has 4 kids, live in Englewood, New Jersey, and he serves on the executive board at the Moriah School. Join me in welcoming Rabbi Justin Pines.
Thanks, Emily. Is this working? Good? You don't have to read that whole thing, but that was, yes, self-indulgent. Thank you so much for sharing it. Hi, everyone. I first want to just, before I say anything, just say that it's super inspiring to see 2 communities, 2 synagogues collaborate in this way. I haven't seen it that often. Maybe that's super common, and I just haven't seen it. But it's just very, it's cool. It's very special that you do that, and it speaks a lot to the type of community that you have when people can come together in a meaningful way. So I echo the thank yous that Emily shared for the clergy, for the lay leadership, for the professionals here, for all of you who chose to spend your evening here this evening, and those of you on Zoom. And I stand here inspired. I also want to say that for me, as Emily mentioned, I spent 3 years here when I was living in Cambridge, so it's good for me to be back in the Boston area as well. In addition to that, my parents both went to Boston University, so I have like deeper ties. And my wife's parents spent a lot of time in Brookline. They were at Rabbi Soloveitchik's synagogue at Maimonides. My father-in-law was, I'm terrible at this, but at Harvard Medical School, he was the chief radiation oncology, oh man, I'm terrible at this. Chief resident in radiation oncology before they moved to Long Island. And he spent, I think, 7 years here as well, and was very close with the Rav. He's written a lot on the Rav, and he took, when the Rav became too ill, he took over leading high holiday services in Maimonides. And even after they left Brookline, my wife's the baby. It's like baby, 9 years, my wife. So she didn't grow up here, but she grew up coming here for the high holidays every year, doing the drive, which is insane because they went up like right before Yom Kippur, and then as soon as the fast ended, they would eat and get back on the road. And my father-in-law was the one who did all the driving and did all the leading of the prayers and then came back. So anyway, many heroes are in Boston, but those are some of my ties to Boston, and I'm very grateful to be here. So what I want to do tonight is the following. There's a lot of different ways to come into this conversation around how we think about Israel. I can only bring like the couple things that I think about, and hopefully they'll be helpful to you. As Emily mentioned in my bio, I'm someone who's drawn to thinking about the way in which the lives we've lived, the stories we tell, shape who we are and shape the conversations that we have. And so I'd like to kind of use, and another way of putting that might be through a Musser lens, let's say, but I'll get to that. So what I want to do tonight is kind of go through kind of a couple big lessons that I take from Musar and from my life, and those go in and out. I think a typical way to think about Musar is someone who uses their own personal experiences as a learning. You know, as much as the texts are text, the people are text, if that makes sense. And I guess the text I know the best is the text that I'm stuck with forever. This is who I am. And so I'll kind of I want to start with, I'll go through a few different areas, but I want to start with the following, which is clarifying what are my North Stars, clarifying who are my heroes, and the ways that it has influenced the way in which I see and think about the world, both as hakarat hatov, as gratitude towards them, but also a way of placing myself in this room, let's say, beyond the kind of the bio in there. And so I'll share 3 things, which are as follows. The first is that I'm heavily influenced by my maternal grandfather, my Zadie Murray Pantier, and my father, and I'll share the following about them and kind of what I take from them. The first, as Emily mentioned, all 4 of my grandparents are survivors, and they all kind of express that in their lives differently. My grandfather, Murray Pantier, lost all 6 siblings and both parents in the Shoah. He had 1 uncle who survived, and he kind of came here with literally nothing, and went from trying to find work, which took some time, and learn the language, which took some time, to eventually becoming someone who was fully American, fully pro-Israel, fully successful, and really a model citizen, I would say, in his community. And he was among, you don't hear of many Holocaust survivors who are very serious New York Ranger fans and Dodger fans. Yeah, exactly. Let's go Rangers. I know you're not allowed to say that here, but I'm with you. Let's go Rangers. I actually I feel connected to the Rangers through my grandfather still. And I'll indulge just because you clapped that when the Rangers were in the Eastern Conference Finals in 1994, it was Game 7. My grandfather, who survived the Holocaust, saved by Oskar Schindler, couldn't stay for the end of the game because it was too stressful for him, which is like great. Yeah. And they won. Yeah, Matto, exactly. But I met Matto and told him the story, by the way, which was great. Anyway, but we'll come back to where we are. So I don't want to spend. We could just talk about my grandfather and my father tonight, but I'll kind of just focus on a couple things and how they shaped me. The first is the way my grandfather lived his life was very much not only like a love for life coming out of the Holocaust, but a sense of everything that you have is a gift, and with every gift comes responsibility. So the responsibility of being the one survivor from his family, what came with that, and reconstituting a family, continuing a Jewish legacy, but also as he became more successful, the gifts that he had, his sense of humor, his ability to lead, the way that he became successful in business, his time. He decided that any gift he has, he was going to put, as someone who had been on the other side and said, I need help when I got here, someone who was going to spend his life devoted to taking the gifts that he had and putting them to use. And I see that as a lesson. My father lost his father when he was young, but my father, through his father-in-law, my grandfather, also really carries that. He's someone who is a lay business person during the day, but really devotes his free time to supporting various causes. So I think one North Star for me is the sense of what does it mean to recognize the gifts that we have and to feel not like an opportunity, but really an obligation to put them into use. So that's one thing that I'm thinking about. And as we go through this, we'll think about how that shows up in thinking about Israel and how we show up as individuals in Israel. The second thing that I'll share as a North Star, so the first was gifts and obligation. The second is, I mentioned earlier over dinner that I'm a student of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, which was also in the bio. I encountered him in Chovevei Torah in rabbinical school, and I had the opportunity to work for him for 3 years after rabbinical school, which was like, we could also just do a night on talking about what I learned there. I'll just say, like, it was an amazing zchut, an amazing merit to just spend time with someone like that on a day-to-day basis and just come visit him at his house and hang out with his wife Blue and him and have lunch with them. And even more than the crazy ideas, notice how he handles a fender bender, or what he does when his wife buys him the wrong shirts. These very small moments of not only sharing ideas but living them. And I'll say that from him, among many things, but I think relevant tonight and my North Stars is his concept that growing out of the Gemara and Sanhedrin, which talks about why was Adam created as an individual, this idea that we learn that number one is they're an individual because to show us that every life is of infinite value. Right? So we've heard the phrase before, he who saves one life saves the world, he who destroys one life destroys the world. My grandfather was fond of saying that. I had no idea it was from Sanhedrin. So Rabbi Yitz teaching us that every life is infinitely valuable. And then the second one saying that because everyone came from the same person, that everyone is equal in value. No one can say my ancestor was better than your ancestors. So number two is everyone's infinite, everyone's equal in value. And then the third being because noticing that if a human makes a coin, all the coins are stamped and look the same way. But when God makes a human, each person is totally unique. That there is no other person in the history of the universe that will be that person or has been that person. When I do weddings, I try to remind the couple leading up to it this idea that not only did you choose this person from, let's call it the pool of applicants that you encountered in this world, but actually you chose them from the pool of people in the history of time going backwards and forwards. This is the person that you're choosing to try to spend your life with right now. And so noticing that. So the second thing that I kind of take with me, this idea from Rabbi Yitz, is that in the world, what we're trying to do in the world is create a world that lives up to that ideal. We're trying to build towards a society where every human is treated as infinitely valuable, unique, and equal. Right? Can we, as we think about anything, how we do medical care, how we welcome people into a synagogue, how we sit at a table, can I treat people as infinitely valuable, equal, and unique? That's the second kind of North Star. The third North Star is Musar. So I had the merit, I guess, to stumble upon Musar when I was living in Harnof in a Haredi neighborhood in Israel. Briefly, a few people shared from a book called Alei Shur by Rabbi Shlomo Volbe, which is an amazing book, not in English yet, but one day we're working on it. And I was very taken into it, and then I was in a fellowship called the Wexner Fellowship with Jen Weinstock, who now is at CJP, used to be at Gann Academy, who introduced me to Rabbi David Jaffe, who I'm sure people know in this area, who kind of became my chavruta and really mentored me around Musar, and that's become like kind of an animating feature of the way I think about the world and the way I am in the world. So those are my 3 North Stars that I bring here. Everything we have, every gift we have, whatever it is, something that's internal, external, comes with an obligation to put it into the world. Hila and I have had conversations around like the guilt that comes with like, what if I'm not using my gifts well, and what if I'm using them the wrong way? And it's something that I sit with. It probably causes more anxiety than anything else in my life, I would say. Even the shift from working as a lawyer to a rabbi, I'm like, what if my gift was to be like a super successful lawyer and serve as a lay leader, and I'm doing the wrong thing? And I guess I'll find out at the end. We'll discuss one day. So those are my 3, and I will say. So those are my North Stars. Now I want to talk about a couple other elements of kind of headline things that I learned from Musar that might inform the way we think about how we think about Israel, if that makes sense. And I also want to just note, there are sources in front of you. Think of them as a gift. I'm not going to spend time deeply going to each one. A lot of things I'm talking about are in here. Some things I won't get to are in here. If you ignore everything I say and tonight you go home and choose to learn a piece of Torah, or next week, then like, Dayenu, at least I came here and shared something with you that you learned on your own, but they're there for you to learn, but I'm not going to go deep into them here. I want to kind of just do it outside, if that makes sense. So the next thing I want to think about is, so we've talked about our North Stars. I want to talk about how often when we think about Israel, one of the big points of contention, especially in North America, is how we talk to others about Israel. Right? We have these moments where there's a conflict, or there's not even a conflict because we don't even want to talk with that person about it, right? You hear stories of people who are like, Israel is off limits at our table. Or, I just don't want to read anything written by this news, whatever, website, because what they say is like not kosher, and this sense of like inability to have conversations that are meaningful around Israel. And what I want to do is, before focusing on the interactions with others, use a Musar lens to say everything starts with the self. That we have to first take our lens and look inwards and have an understanding of who's showing up at the table. Who's the person? Who am I when I come into a conversation? And what I want to look at is both the lens of, let's just call them simply in science terms, nature and nurture. As kind of 2 important things, our baggage that we bring when we have a conversation. And so on the nature front, I think the importance of noticing who I am and what type of personality I have. Hartman has a lot of beautiful Torah around, like my colleagues, around if you're talking with someone about Israel and you say the word justice and they say the word justice, you might have totally different understandings of the word justice means, and that's why it doesn't work. I want to go even deeper into ourselves, not just this word justice that's out there, but also look into like, what type of person am I coming to this conversation, and what type of person is someone else? And I don't want to, in that assumption, assume that like people on the left are one type of person and people on the right are another type of person. That's not what I'm saying. I want us to notice as individuals who we might be. And so I'll offer one frame that speaks to me within Judaism, which is developed. I'm trying to think who to give credit to here. I mean, Kabbalah. Which it traces its way through Kabbalah. I think I encountered it through Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, who was a British rabbi from Gateshead, England, in the past 150 years or so. And the way he lays it out, working from a midrash, is as follows: that if you look at our ancestors, there's kind of 3 core character traits that shows up. He uses the lens of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But I think that later people have explained that also applies to other members of our matriarchs as well. And the way he puts it is, Abraham is chesed, is the idea of kindness. And of course, we've heard that before. This idea that what was the driving, animating soul trait of Abraham was chesed. When he walked into a room, his first question was, I see people in front of me, what are their needs? How can I address their needs? That's what's driving me. That's what's moving me forward. That's my core midah. And then you had Isaac, whose core midah was yira, or awe of the heavens. And Isaac came along and said, okay, it's about self-discipline. It's about putting the self aside and encountering God or the heavens or awe. So the way you look at the world is less horizontal and more vertical, let's say. Right? And you can imagine situations where someone's like, what's right here or what's meant to happen. I don't have a personal, it's not about what I want here, it's just about like the right thing according to, let's say, God, or according to what's right, however you might determine that. And then the third is Jacob, is Yaakov, who comes in with the idea of emet, or truth. And so emet, I think a simple way is to say that like emet is a combination of chesed and yira. I don't want to say that. I want to say that emet is just the idea, the ability to see multiple sides of things and create like shlemut, like something like wholesome, the truth within there. I could go into deep examples of each of those. I don't know if it makes sense to do that as far as our time now, although I'm thrilled to talk about it with anyone who wants to afterwards. It's an area that really excites me and interests me. But I offer it to you as a way to think about if you're a person whose core midah is emet, and you're in conversation with a person whose core midah is chesed. How might that conversation look? And how might it look different if you were to step back and notice that for a second and say, wow, I'm an emet person, this is a chesed person, we're coming at this problem totally differently. And again, I'm not at all suggesting that there are certain factions politically that are one or more chesed or more yira or more emet. I just want us to pay attention to the ways in which sometimes the person that I bring, my natural driven character traits, shape the way that I might have conversations with others. And by the way, like it's not just about politics, right? This is true in the people that you live with, right? Sometimes noticing what drives certain people versus what drives yourself is important. And I'll also add, of course, no one is one of them alone. But I think, as Rav Dessler puts it out, you have a core. So it could be your sense of emet leads you to chesed, or your sense of yira leads you to chesed, or your sense of chesed leads you to be like, how can I do chesed in a more emet way? But I think noticing what's at the core. And again, that's a frame for it, but I think just the general principle is, what's the nature of the person coming into the conversation? The second piece of that is nurture. Noticing, and this is, I think, a huge, huge challenge when it comes to how we think about Israel, is noticing both historically who's in the conversation, right? People who lived through 48, lived through 67, lived through Soviet Jewry, lived through Ethiopian Jewry, didn't live through any of those things, right? Lived through Rabin's assassination. Think of Israel as the startup nation. Noticing Begadol, how do we have conversations across generations where people haven't had those shared experiences that we're relying on? And then, of course, within that as well, also the individual experiences. Because it could be that two people are the exact same age and live through the same events, but how they interpreted them or other small events that happen to them as individuals totally shapes the way they show up at a conversation. And again, I'm focusing on the idea of when I'm talking to someone else, noticing who I am and noticing the person I'm speaking to. I spoke about nature, now I'm speaking about nurture. And I'll just give a couple examples of nurture. Before I get to Israel, I'll just talk about, we mentioned the Rangers before, I'll talk about the Knicks and the Celtics for a second. I apologize for the sports metaphors for those who are like, stop talking about sports. I have a joke about that too, but I'll save it. I grew up a Knicks fan. My father was from Brooklyn, New York. He told me stories, I'm getting thumbs up, of Walt Clyde Frazier and Earl the Pearl Monroe and Willis Reed and Dollar Bill Bradley and these kind of heroes of the past who won the championship twice and made it 3 times. And these were his formative years. He was like right at the age of loving sports when they were all doing these things. And I watched videos about it. I knew their numbers. I knew everything about them. Right? And then I grew up in the 90s when the Rangers won the cup. But the Knicks, at least, were good. They made it twice. They had a heartbreaking loss. I remember crying in my bed when John Starks missed every shot he took that night. But I had these formative experiences of love and investment in the Knicks. At the same time, by the way, my father hated the Celtics because he grew up when the Celtics won every year when the Knicks weren't winning. But I was post Larry Bird, so I didn't know about the Celtics being good. And when I was there, D. Brown, I guess, was the star of the team at that time. There was definitely not as strong of a team. So I had no hatred for the Celtics. I hated the Miami Heat and the Indiana Pacers, et cetera. And then I lived in Boston for 3 years. My first year, the Celtics were terrible, by the way. I was here from 06 to 09. But I had Nesson instead of MSG, which is what we have in New York. And so I would watch Tommy Heinsohn, is that his name? The guy who does the audio. Great. He's, by the way, that introduced me to the Boston accent. He's wonderful. And I apologize that I'm on this sports tick here, but I'll just say, because I think it gets us somewhere. And then all of a sudden, my second year, they got Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen, and all of a sudden, they were this super exciting team to watch. And the Knicks were could not make more bad decisions, and I was just I'm done with the Knicks. I'm on the Celtics bandwagon. And my whole family was like, you cannot do that. The Celtics are the enemy. I'm like, no, the Celtics are not the enemy. What about all the other teams I grew up hating? But I mentioned that. It's no way ever could my father have ever imagined in his life his son rooting for the Celtics. Of course, now, I can't avoid it. I feel like as Met fans, it's the same thing. I have to love the Knicks, even though it's the most torturous fan experience on the planet. So I still am a Knicks fan at core, but I have this like feel for the Celtics. So I give that as an example of nurture in a very light way. And now I'll give an example of nurture like on the Israel front, which is a little bit more complicated. And I'll speak for myself, and I'm sure everyone here has stories. And I think, I encourage people to notice those, notice them about ourselves, notice them about the people we're in conversation with. So for me, I'll say that kind of a few different big moments that have shaped the way I thought about Israel. The first was in middle school, going to Israel. For the first, I think I'd been there before that, but the first time I was like, let's call it like a more thinking human being. As I get older, I realize I'm still not a thinking human being. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I thought that then. But I went to Israel, and I had gotten really into Judaism. I was Shomer Shabbat. I was rah-rah Judaism, learning everything I could. And then I got there, and the country was not Shomer Shabbat. And that like broke my brain. I was totally in shock. I was like, I feel like the people who came from like Africa who were like expected the temple to be there when they got to Israel, and there was no temple, and they were so disappointed. So I got there, and I was like, don't they read Tanakh? Don't they know if they don't keep Shabbat, Hashem will kick them out of the land? Like, what's going on here? So that was my first moment of like, oh, like there's this like these texts that we read, and then there's also like the actual state of Israel, which I think I didn't even totally comprehend then. I just remember being aha at that moment. The second I'll say actually happened at the Hartman basketball court. This is not a Hartman story, but there's a basketball court next to Hartman that kind of people who want to use can use. They let the community use it. I don't know if it's still the case. And so when I was at Pardes for the year in 05, 06, we used to play basketball on Fridays there. I guess I like sports. That's coming out of this. You asked me what I do in my free time. I play sports, apparently. So we would play on Fridays, and we had some kind of program that made us shift the timing of our Friday basketball game. And it happened to be this one week, while we started playing, about 20 minutes in, a bunch of Israelis showed up to play. And they were like, we're playing soccer now. We're like, well, we're playing basketball. And they're like, well, we're playing soccer now. I'm like, well, the court is long this way. Why don't we cut it this way? And we'll do basketball on the short length, and you'll do soccer next to us. And they're like, no, we're going to play soccer now. And we kind of had this like confrontation a little bit. And at some point, one of the Israeli kids headbutt one of the people in our group. And again, I was totally shocked by this experience. I literally started saying like, Anachnu achim, we're brothers. Like, how could you do this? Right? Whereas if this happened in Central Park, even if it was a Jew, I would be like, let's get out of here. But for some reason in Israel, I had this like assumption in my mind that we are this family where no one is mean to each other, because how could we be mean to each other? Which, by the way, I can now analyze. Like I've heard people say before, Israel's our cousins, and I hate my cousins. But I guess I grew up in a family where a family was close. So for me, family is a good thing, and I know that I shouldn't take that for granted, I've learned. But certainly in my mind, I thought that Israel was this like place of family where everyone's nice and there's no crime and everyone's perfect and we're just like love each other. And that it was an awakening moment for me, let's say, as well. So the learning happens outside the Beit Midrash. The third, I'll say that if that was like sad, this gets sadder. I had the amazing merit when I married my wife, Tali, to live in Israel. I was in yeshiva for the year, and after we got married, she came and joined me in Israel, and we lived in Yerushalayim, like super amazing, lucky thing to be able to spend the first few months of your marriage with your wife in Israel. And that was the summer where the 3 boys were abducted in Gush and murdered. I just remember feeling so powerless in that moment. Feeling like I'm literally living here. I'm in this country. I have no ability to in any way shape those things from happening, not happening, anything on the ground, and feeling very powerless. And that was actually, I think, when I look back, I think part of my turning to Musar came from that. It was kind of like, well, I'm in rabbinical school because I'm going to change the world, but like maybe if I could just work on like trying to be a better human being on a daily basis and shape the relationships that I have in front of me, hopefully not blind to the world beyond it, but what can I control and what can't I control, and can I try to work on the things that I can control? And so I think that shaped me. And then the fourth thing that I'll say is joining Hartman significantly changed me. Because I think before I came to Hartman, as you know, I was director of character development. My thing was I want to help people focus on their character. I want them to look to Judaism, not just American secular liberal values, about how to think about, I think people think like, Judaism teaches you about Shabbat, how to be a person. We look to American secular values, and I really wanted people to look to Jewish wisdom. And sitting at Hartman kind of, and I supported Israel, always. I loved it, but it was more like I sent a check. It was not like this is something that I engage with intellectually or meaningfully, because I think it was kind of too hard in some ways. And then I think coming to Hartman, a few things happened there. One was my colleagues pushed me. They were kind of like, But you don't live in a random time where the only job is to focus on being like a better Jew. You live in a time where we're a powerful minority in North America, and we live in a time where the state of Israel is here, and these are the generations that are building the state of Israel. So you can't write this off. Get into this conversation. That's kind of brought me into it meaningfully. And I think also it's a great place for that to have happened to me. I'm grateful for the Hartman Beit Midrash because I'm surrounded by colleagues who are willing to face difficult questions head on, that are willing to have meaningful disagreements about questions and willing to model how to have those disagreements. And so that has kind of found a way, on the back end of the Gush experience, back into the Israel conversation. So I give all those examples, the Shomer Shabbat example, the basketball soccer headbutting example, the Gush summer example, and the Hartman example, just as examples within me, and I think we could all think about ourselves, of the ways in which the experiences I've had, the things that I've gone through, have shaped the way that I think of Israel, separate from the big things. I mean, Gush is a big thing, obviously, but separate, like Yitzhak Rabin's assassination, that was a huge thing for me, but that was kind of like my whole school, right? Everyone was thinking about it. So how do we notice, again, when we're having a conversation with someone who's either lived through different big experiences or has had their own mini versions of these experiences, how has it shaped who they are, and how might that help us bridge a gap when we're having a conversation with someone who's very different from us, either in our home, in our synagogue, in our, I don't know, sister synagogue, like friend synagogue, or in Israel, right, as well. So now we've talked a little bit around how we think about ourselves as individuals showing up in a conversation, this idea of the nature and the nurture, and I mentioned a little bit around how noticing who I am coming into the conversation, also being aware of the other person coming in. I want to spend a few more minutes thinking about how the individual fits into the whole, into the larger picture. I think often, even if we can figure out our own individual selves, we kind of can get into the habit of assuming, like, if everyone were just a little bit more like me, then this would be much better. Because then we could all just think this way, and that's the right answer, because I know the right answer. And how we might think about not just conflict resolution, but really the Jewish value of thinking about the individual as a part of the whole. And I'll just share a couple ideas on that as well. I'm trying to think of the best way to share this. I'll share it as follows. I talked at the beginning around the idea of Adam being created as the first human being, and those three dignities: infinite value, equal, unique. So kind of on the heels of the Adam story, we have all of Breshit. We have the stories of our matriarchs and patriarchs. And if you think about it for a second, I don't know if people have saw this before, but the word Yisrael, right, Yud, Sin, Resh, Aleph, Lamed, is actually an amalgamation, which I think means an acrostic with more than one thing in each category. Is that right? I think that's what it is an amalgamation of our matriarchs and patriarchs. So Yud is Yitzchak and Yaakov, Sin is Sarah, Resh is Rivka and Rachel, Aleph is Abraham, and Lamed is Leah. And I say that not to be like, this is cute. I say that to actually think meaningfully. I think there's like a deep message in that. Right there, by the way, there's a lot of ways to think about the word Israel. We could do a whole, just a night on that. But this is one that I just want to play with for a second, which is, I think there's a message in there, which is noticing there's no one letter, right? There's these 7 letters, and within them, the same way we have the cheseds and the emets and the yiras in our tradition, we also have this sense that each of our matriarchs and patriarchs together make Yisrael. Right? And it's not that we just need a world of yuds. It's not that. Right? It's that we need each of those things coming together for it to work. And by the way, it starts with them, but it's all of Tanakh. How fascinating Tanakh is this? We start with them in Genesis, but then we come to Shemot, which we're in now, and we have Moshe, right? We have Miriam, we have Aaron, we have Pinchas later on, right? We have Shifra and Puah, by the way. Shifra and Puah, whoa, in the first chapter of Shemot, right? So we have this idea of that everyone, we need everyone. We need all the pieces. We need each person to kind of play their part for the whole to be stronger. And the goal is not for each person to be the same. And I'll say that the other place I think that really comes through is the story of Yaakov and the tribes of Israel. So you have Yaakov, who is Emet. His whole thing is, I want to have a vision of the world where it can work out. Everyone can be together. He's the first one to bless his kids or his grandkids, to meet his grandkids, right? And what's different from Yaakov from his predecessors is, yes, there's the fight. Yosef gets sent away, but by the end they're back together. He doesn't preside over a home with his wives where someone has to leave, right? He, at the end of his life, is able to give a unique blessing to each child, and that says, Yisachar, you're a Yisachar, Zvulun, you're Zvulun, right? I'm going to look at each of you differently, and you need to be you for this to be successful. And he messages that to each of them, right? And the same thing with Ephraim and Manasseh as well. And so he sets up this paradigm of what does it mean to see each person as, again, this idea of unique we spoke about in the beginning, infinite as we spoke about in the beginning, equal as we spoke about in the beginning. Each of these children has a role to play that is unique and totally different than everyone else. I mean, it's a beautiful idea that I saw, which was that, and I'm sorry, I need to look up who said it. I feel terrible because I should say B'Shem Amro, that Rivka and Yitzchak made a mistake as parents. What was their mistake? That they tried to raise two Yaakovs, right? They had a Yaakov and an Esav, and they tried to raise two Yaakovs. And when you try to raise two Yaakovs, and one of your kids is not a Yaakov, they're an Esav, you're going to get what Esav became instead. And that if Esav had been raised as an Esav, he would be part of the Jewish people. He would have, he would have been, there would have been a soul world that came from him within our tradition. And so starting to notice a little bit when we look out onto others, when we think of who am I and how do I fit in, trying to flip the switch a little bit and be less concerned with how come I'm a Yaakov type, how come there aren't more Yaakovs out there, but being like, oh, this is an Esav, and how can they be an Esav, and how can we be in conversation? And when someone seems to be in conflict with us or different from us, kind of appreciating that instead of pushing it down. A good friend of mine, Dan Zavodnik, says, people are people. That's like his Torah. People are people. And if you think about that, it's like the deepest thing ever. It's like, just like very, very simple, which I learned today is a Depeche Mode song, which I didn't know that. But this idea that we spend so much time in our lives often kind of focused on the ways in which people are not us and getting frustrated with that, right? And the importance of sometimes being like, that's who that person is, and you're not going to change them, and can we celebrate them for the way they are, even if it's different than the way that I am? And can we like use that to have a closer relationship instead of a further relationship? By the way, that can apply in very close relationships and also in very distant relationships. And then I'll just add that there's a beautiful Gemara, I want to say in Sanhedrin, which asks the question, what will the name of Mashiach be? And each Beit Midrash, the Beit Midrash of Shiloh says it will be Shiloh, and the Beit Midrash of Yanai says Mashiach's name will be Yanai, right? And it goes through all the names. And I think a cynical reading of that is that like each Beit Midrash thinks that like they're the best, but I think like a more, I guess I would say nuanced and inspired reading of it is that we need each Beit Midrash to be the best version of that Beit Midrash, right? We need Yanai to be Yanai, and we need Shiloh to be Shiloh. And each of them should be pursuing it as though like it depends on them. Depends on them, right? Like as Gila and I were saying, it depends on Shiloh to be Shiloh. If Shiloh is not being Shiloh, it's not going to work for the whole community. Okay, so how do we think of a society in which we have a healthy Shiloh growing into Shiloh and a healthy Yanai growing into Yanai? And I think the language of Mashiach is even more inspiring because we're thinking not just the past, the soul people who came through our tradition, but also even moving forward as we build towards Mashiach, which I'll define in Rabbi Yitz Greenberg terms, which is like thinking of a more perfect world that we're slowly building towards, right? It's not about tomorrow, but it's about incrementally each generation taking a step forward. In order for us to take those steps as a people, we need to move towards each Beit Midrash taking their steps towards that Mashiach. And the other thing that I'll just say about the individual as part of the whole. So I talked about how do we bring our nature and nurture to a conversation, notice how something's different, and then I talked about this amalgamation, this idea that like it's actually built into Judaism. We're meant to have different flavors, and they're meant to be working together and not against each other. I just want to bring up kind of, if we're coming out of Genesis for a second, I want to go into the rest of Torah, into Exodus, and to the idea of our big moment, our moment of Mount Sinai, which is like the seminal moment where we enter into Brit with Hashem, where we enter into covenant. And in that moment, I just want us to like imagine being there for a second. Imagine, 600,000 men is what the Torah says, and let's assume as many women and who knows how many children are standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. And I want us to, if we were there, who would we be there with, right? Most likely we'd be like divided by tribe, and within each tribe we'd be divided by family. And so you'd be sitting there with your family, experiencing this moment. And so even in our most communal moment where it feels like it's like one message for all of us, actually the second that moment ends, and each of those families goes back to their tent, we're already starting this is how my family thinks of this. This is how my family each family is kind of bringing down their own pattern. So over time, we have a sense of like the global, larger Jewish, let's call it like vision or like project that's coming down. But then we also have the individual family by family mission that's coming down from that moment. Right? I think the place that I feel that the most is in marriage. Right? So I grew up with the patterns of my home. This is, in my home, we don't leave lights on. That's something I was like raised with. My father was like, I don't want to create more dependence on oil because that gives money to the Arabs and it's bad for Israel. So in our house, we don't waste lights. Lights have to be off. That was a huge deal, right? And then I married someone who like lights wasn't a thing. And by the way, they're like super Zionistic. Her father's from Israel. They're not the same thing. That's not how you express your Zionism, through keeping lights off, right? And so, and I think anyone who comes into any meaningful relationship, and certainly a marriage, notices like, whoa, we're bringing totally different patterns. Even though and by the way, we're like, how many degrees apart are our family within like the Jewish people? Not that many, right? So imagine if it was like, a Jew from like, I don't know, Indonesia, it would be even more different. But I shouldn't make an assumption that a country makes it more different. It could be someone next door. But the patterns that each of us bring have been passed down, have come through our families. And then all of a sudden, when you create a marriage with someone, you have to create new patterns. And so noticing, even within our Mount Sinai moment, our big communal covenantal moment, there's also built into it on purpose is a family, individual experience, something that's being brought down that's going to shape the way that you think about this and pass it down. And so same thing, when we're thinking about the individual and the content of the whole, noticing what's the patterns that I'm bringing with me, and what are the patterns the other person's bringing? Are we even conscious of the patterns? How do they shape the way we talk about it? So I talked a little bit around my 3 North Stars. I talked about nature and nurture. I talked about these different ways of thinking about how the individual is in a conversation, noticing how to think about the whole, how to think about the people who are different than you, how to think about their patterns. Maybe they're a different letter in the amalgamation. Maybe they're a different Beit Midrash bringing Mashiach. Another piece of Musar that I want to bring that I think is relevant here is a kind of a big idea in Musar is the clarification of what is the ideal and what is the real. Right? Musar is set out for yourself your goal, notice for yourself, to cheshbon hanefesh, do a soul accounting of where you are, and what are the exercises or the ways of being you can come up with to close that gap. And you can pick anything that you want to be better at, right? If it is sports, then it might be like, I want to be better at shooting a basketball, so I'm going to practice shooting a basketball until I get better at shooting a basketball. Well, let's say it's, I want to be more focused when I walk into my home. I notice that when I walk into my home, I'm like totally frazzled from work, and I come in like in a mess, and I'm not present with people. So I have this ideal, and then I have the real, and then how might I get there? So for example, just to play that one out, I might say to myself, I'm going to use the mezuzah as a tool. Before I open my door, I'm going to pause, I'm going to look at the mezuzah, I'm going to kiss it, I'm going to think about who I am, I'm going to think about the type of person I want to be on the other side of that door, I'm going to take a breath, and then I'm going to try to do it. Could be that I fail anyway, but the idea is, again, set a goal and notice where we are and bridge the gap. I think for those of you who are at CLP, at our community leadership program, so we have, I think some have been, but we have a leadership program in Israel every summer where lay leaders come to study with us. And so our question this past summer was, why Israel? My colleague, our North American president, Yehuda Kurtzer, asked the question, why Israel? And kind of the thesis of his talk was basically noticing that we stopped dreaming. We stopped clarifying when we think about Israel, what's the ideal? We spent all this time fighting about the ideal leading up to 48, and then 48 happened, and then we stopped thinking about the ideal, because then we're just trying to stay in business. Right? Any institution, you're trying to imagine it, and then once you build it, you're just trying to stay in business. And so we stopped dreaming. And he encouraged us to think and step back for a second and focus on, clarify what is the ideal. And I would say that the ideal of love Israel, be loyal, is not sticky. It's not sticking with it. Maybe it worked, but it's not working. And I would say, by the way, similarly in North America, the ideal of never again, when we think about the Holocaust, also is no longer working because it's not enough. Jewish continuity is not enough for people. You can't tell people you need to keep being Jewish and not say why. They need to have something sticky to get into there. So I think when it comes to Israel, using this Musar lens, clarifying for ourselves what's the ideal. And the ideal can't be win the next election. Right? It's more than that. It can't be a small political thing. I think those things are super important when you I worked in program design. If you're going to put on a conference, you need to think of the 10 things that need to happen for that conference to happen. So yes, it's important to think of the battles along the way that get you closer to the ideal, but how do we keep our eye on the ideal when we're thinking about Israel and keep coming back to that? And if we don't have an organizing principle around Israel, what could be our organizing principle around Israel? And I'll say on that note, I don't want to kind of go through. We could go through like classic versions of that. I'll just offer one, which is from David Hartman, the founder of the Hartman Institute, in his seminal essay, which I'm sure some people have seen, but if others haven't, I'll just say it, which is his essay Auschwitz versus Sinai, which is noticing when we're thinking about Israel, what's our North Star? I opened with North Stars. Is it Auschwitz or Sinai? Are we trying to prevent another Auschwitz with the creation of the state of Israel, or are we trying to bring to life what happened at Sinai in a country when we think about Israel? I think that's one way. We could talk about other ways, but that's one powerful way to think meaningfully when we think about what's the ideal, what are we dreaming about when we think of Israel. That's one example of that. Okay, so again, I know I'm saying a lot of things, but I talked about my North Stars. We talked about nature and nurture. We talked about the individual and how they relate to the whole, and we talked about the ideal and the real. Another thing that come with the ideal and the real is how do you close that gap? Right? So step one is clarifying what the ideal is and what the real is. But there's another piece, which is how do you close the gap? And there's many ways to do that. Rabbi Jaffe has taught me many of them. I want to just focus on one of them, which is the word hitlamdut. I'm throwing out a complicated Hebrew word that's like a reflexive learning kind of is what it means. But I want to introduce that as a tool, which is the idea of being someone who walks around with learning antennae on their head at all times. Someone who's, no matter what's going on in life, any experience you're going through, you're trying to learn. And as Rav Shlomo Volbe, who created the idea or introduced us to the idea, points out, he's a Haredi Musar rabbi who died in 2008, I want to say. He says that someone who's a mit lamed, someone who does hitlamdut, doesn't die, they learn how to die, right? And so if you could think about that, right? You think about what does it mean to go through every stage of our life, not just the ones when we're kids, but all new stages, and recognize that everything is a learning moment, a learning opportunity. And so bringing that lens to how we think about our own lives, but certainly also when we have conversations with people we disagree with. What are the ways that I can learn from others? What are the ways that I can keep growing and learning? I will say, I'll share as a personal example that I was in Boca Raton last Shabbat, and someone there suggested I read Ambassador David Friedman's book. How many people have read the book? That's what I figured. So I want to just raise that as an example of the following, which was, whatever anyone's politics are, I want to just pause for a second and just say, like, here is a Jew who served as the ambassador from the United States to Israel, who I think by all measures was kind of the most influential ambassadors, not only to Israel, but all American ambassadors, like in history, is the way the Times was like, he's probably the most influential ambassador to any country from America, who had some like major impact. Evaluate it how you want to evaluate it. Jerusalem Embassy, Abraham Accords, make of it what you will. But I think like it's kind of interesting that we live in a society where like we had a person in our generation who did that experience, and like half of our society is like, I don't even want to hear what he says, right? And I guess totally, there are probably things he may have said when he was in that role that might have offended certain people. But I think like just to be like, I want to hear his story. There's nothing at stake anymore. He's telling the story of what happened, what it went through, how he convinced Donald Trump to do this, and how he managed to do this with Jared Kushner and all these pieces. And I read it in like 2 days. It was an easy read, by the way. I'm not saying like everyone should read that book, but I'm using it as a example for a moment to be like, what might it be like to put on our curiosity lenses, right? The Pirkei Avot says, who is wise? Someone who learns from every person. And the Bartanura, the famous commentary on Pirkei Avot, basically says, why is it learning from every person? Because they're willing to learn from someone of lesser stature. Not even someone you disagree with, someone who's like a child or someone you think is less smart than you, let's say. Why? Because that person clearly is pursuing truth and not pursuing honor, right? They're not focused on, I can't learn from this person, but they're focused on like, my goal is to seek truth in the universe. Maybe that's an Emet person, a Yaakov person, to go back to what we said before. And so I want to be curious to learn from others. And so this could be an opportunity, a way to think about what are the ways we might enter, either through a friend or through a book, but what are ways in to learn and get just a taste of the perspective of people we, at first glance, might severely disagree with. And then along those lines, I want to offer another midrash. This is from Genesis Rabbah 65, I believe, which is a beautiful midrash, and it ties in nicely to what we said before about the kind of this chesed, yira, and emet. So there it talks about how Avraham, it talks about the idea of what's called a kli, an instrument. The idea of what's a kli and a kind of an opportunity for growth in life. And so the examples it gives are as follows, that Abraham said to God, my core thing is chesed. When a father and son walk into my tent, I can't tell which one's the father and the son because they look the same. Back then, they looked the same, right? So Abraham says to God, could you please invent old age so that I can know which one's older, which one's younger, so that I could show proper kavod. So God gives Abraham the kli, the instrument of old age, so that he can actualize in an even stronger way his sense of inner chesed. And that's why we see the first person who's mentioned as growing older is Abraham in all of Torah, right? And then Yitzchak says to God, God, my thing is yira, my thing is awe of the heavens. How can I reach maximum awe of the heavens without any pain and suffering? Could you introduce suffering into the world, right? And the Midrash says that's why Yitzchak became blind, right? Yitzchak became blind so that he could experience suffering to have a better sense of the awe of the heavens. I'm not doing a theodicy class today, and we could talk about whether suffering is good or bad, but I think let's just play with the idea of the kli. And then Yaakov comes along and says, I'm emet. I'm about truth. I'm about creating a society where people can coexist and be in conversation with one another. God, the way the world works right now is that you just suddenly die one day. Could I have a request? Could I have 2 or 3 days of being ill before I die so I have some notice to say goodbye to my family and to set everything straight? And then we have also the first person mentioned being ill is Yosef. It says Yosef heard his father was ill, right? And so each of these 3 people, core to who they are offered a kli, an instrument, as an opportunity for growth. And again, I'm not making the claim. I'm not saying people should go into hospitals and say, like, suffering's great. Yitzhak asked for it. But I think the rabbis are trying to teach us to think about some things that might appear to be challenges, to look at them as an opportunity for growth, as a kli. I will say for myself personally, and my mother-in-law always says, like, when things are bad, it should be a kapara. That should be the worst thing that happens. So this should be the worst thing that happens. I've been dealing with like a back thing. So like right around Thanksgiving, I got like a herniated disc in my back. I was lying on the floor. I couldn't do anything. And I kind of went through this like experience of like, what's going on with my life? Like I can't do anything. I'm getting older. I'm stuck at home. I can't leave. It felt like COVID without being contagious kind of. I was just like stuck on the couch for like weeks. And like over time, like I was able to kind of put my Hit Lamdut hat back on and like try to think of this as a kli and be like, oh wait, like God's forcing me in this moment to like go from 125% to 20%. Like what's my 20%? If I can only do like 1/6 of the things that I want to be doing, what are those things? Because I just can't do everything right now. And by the way, I have like a 6-month-old baby who I don't spend that much time with, and he's the only one that'll hang out with me because I have to lie on the floor and he lies on the floor. And we like my wife would be like, well, you can't watch the other kids, so just lie on your stomach because that's what's comfortable for you, and I'll put him down next to you and just watch him for the next hour. And which I did, which was amazing. We like deeply encountered each other and spent a lot of like unexpected moments together. But I think of that as an example. Again, I'm not minimizing pain or suffering, but how we might think of klis as instruments of growth. And so coming back to thinking about Israel, I think that's also in some ways we could think of it that way. Like Israel is a kli of our generation, the same way being a powerful minority in North America is a kli of our generation. Like this is what we're playing in. This is where we're doing our sketching and drawing right now. It's in this time where Israel exists, and we're thinking about what Israel might look like, what Israel should look like, how we as individuals show up in that conversation. And so in sometimes those moments where it might feel particularly dark, how can we look at it slightly differently as something as, yes, I was in pain for a few days first before I realized there was a kli, but can we approach it as a kli? Can it be a Hit Lamdut opportunity, an opportunity to learn how to do something differently? And I'll say that on that front as well, where we direct our Hit Lamdut is a big deal. Right? I think where you focus your learning. So I'm suggesting we learn from people who are different from us, but I also want to name that sometimes, I think certainly in North America, and I would say in liberal Jewish circles, perhaps sometimes we focus narrowly on Israel and we lose the other elements of our Judaism. There's a lot of focus on like, let's fight about Israel so I don't have to talk about Judaism in my home, let's say, or the relationships that are very close to me. Someone made a joke the other day that like people on the East and West Coast like are mean to each other and spend all their time fighting about the world out there. And then like if you go to the middle, we think they're so crazy and racist and thoughtless, but they're like so nice to each other, right? And so like how come sometimes like if we're focusing what we're trying to work on getting better at, if it's exclusively Israel, what are we missing on the other side? And then I'll just add one more thing on the topic of Hit Lamdut, which is from Rabbi Beryl Gershenfeld. If you've heard of Me'or, he's the head of Me'or. He was the Rabbi in the yeshiva that I went to in Har Nof in Israel. And he says the following. There's a Gemara in Brachot, which lays out the blessing that we say when we see a multitude of people. So imagine Mount Sinai, 600,000 people. There's a blessing we say when we see that many people, which is Baruch Atah Hashem, Chacham Harazim, the knower of secrets. Okay, that's our blessing, Chacham Harazim. And the rabbis asked, like, why? And Rabbi Gershenwald asked, why? Why are we saying, of all the things to say, why are we saying knower of secrets when we see 600,000 people? And Rabbi Gershenfeld points out the following. He says, when we are in a situation where we see that many people, we might just see like a blob, right? This is this big group of people that like is overwhelming. They're strangers. I don't know what they are. You can imagine people who see the world differently than us might be an example of that. And I know what I know about all of them. But when God sees them, there are all these individuals that consist of endless secrets within them. And that God sees a secret here, a secret here, a secret there, instead of this big blob. And Rabbi Gershenwald goes on to point out as well that the word Raz, secret, if you were to flip the letters, Resh Zayin, would be Zar, which means stranger or foreign, right? And that this is like, in some ways, the challenge of life is trying to flip strangers to secrets. When we go out into the world and we see a bunch of strangers that we make assumptions about who are different than us, how might we instead flip it to secrets and uncovering secrets that are around us? And I'll say even on that front, the example he gives is in the context of a large multitude. I would again say that that's relevant not just out there, but also in here. I would say that as someone who's been married now, we're coming up, I guess, on 8 years, which is, I guess, is short, apparently. But noticing that even the people you spend all day with, the people that you work with, the people that you live with, sometimes have secrets that you could not uncover. You could live with them for 20 years and not uncover those secrets. My favorite example of that, I'll just share, I was discussing with Emily and Gila earlier, so I see them laughing at me, is when I first got married. Before I was married, I lived alone. I had one pillow, and I slept in my bed. And then I got married, and all of a sudden I had 12 pillows. And I was very confused why we needed 3 square pillows, 2 long pillows, 2 sleeping on pillows, 2 little rectangle pillows, a circle pillow in the middle, like this whole kind of like situation. And I was even more like disturbed by the fact that it somehow became my job to remove the pillows before bed and then also put them back on in the morning. And I was just like, what is happening here? I don't and you can imagine being very frustrated day after day going through this. Thank God I learned Musar and Hilam Dud. And one day I finally realized, wow, I should ask my wife, why do we have the pillows? Instead of, flip her from a czar to a Raz, from a strange and foreigner to a secret. In my own marriage, someone who I feel like I know well. So finally one day I just asked her, what's the deal with the pillows? And she answered to me, for me, after me being Tali, my wife, when I come home from a long day, when I go upstairs to our room at the end of the day, to walk into a room where there's beautiful pillows set in a bed brings me joy. It brings me pleasure. Seeing that aesthetic view of what that looks like calms me, makes me feel happy at the end of my day. And so, to me, it's important to do that. By the way, think of our original paradigm. I am not someone who is calmed by aesthetic visions. I mean, I like a sunset. I'm not complaining. Although I do. I feel like in nature I appreciate them much more than in human-made objects. But it's not my way. So it wasn't like, okay, fine, now that you said that, I feel that way. Right? It was something else. It was now I understand something that drives you is having an aesthetically pleasing thing to look at, and a way in which that is expressed is through having these pillows in this way. And now I'm much happier when I'm taking off and putting back on pillows because I have a different mindset around these things. And it's in some ways a funny example, but I think in some ways it's a paradigm for how we might think about having some of these conversations, even when more is at stake, but also, by the way, even when little things are at stake, because how much more healthy would our relationships be if we would sometimes just lead with curiosity instead of making assumptions about others. Okay, so where did we go tonight? I opened up by clarifying my North Stars. I mentioned my father and my grandfather who taught me whatever you have, not an opportunity, an obligation. You have to put it into the world. If you miss it, you missed it. I mentioned Rav Yitz, who said, we have infinite value, equal value, and unique value. That's the world we're trying to build. And I mentioned Musar and David Jaffe, this way of viewing the world as opportunities for growth and noticing how we interact with others. And then I went into relevant Musar ideas as we think about what's happening in Israel and how we relate to it. Step 1 was our nature and nurture. who am I coming into this conversation? What are my core character traits? I'm moved by aesthetically pleasing things. I'm an emet person. I'm a yira person. I'm a chesed person. And then nurture. What are the stories that turn you from a Knicks fan to a Celtics fan? Right? What are the stories that each of us experienced on a national level in Israel and also on a personal level, the headbutt in the basketball court, right? And then we talked about, now that I've clarified who I am coming to the conversation, noticing that someone else is coming to the conversation, in conversation as part of a whole. And then even the person I'm not in conversation with, noticing that like the goal is not to make everyone you. We don't need a family of Yaakovs. We need a Yaakov and an Esau. We need this Yisrael, these 7 different lanes through which our patriarchs and matriarchs come down. And we need each Beit Midrash to achieve its potential to bring Mashiach. And how Mount Sinai was this opportunity to not only have a communal moment, but have a family moment. And how the patterns trickle down through the family and they trickle down to the community, and they're going to be different. And then we talked about the importance of the ideal and the real. That, like, we need organizing principles. We need a vision of what we want for Israel that's beyond one political battle, but is more about the long-term future. And we talked about Auschwitz versus Sinai as examples of what might be our organizing principles. And then we talked about this idea of how do we close the gap between the ideal and the real. This idea of hit lamdut, this idea of having a learning stance literally to the moment of our death. Not dying, but learning how to die. And we talked about how you should all read David Friedman. Kidding. But you understand the idea of, like, what does it mean to learn from others who are different from us? What does it mean to see Israel as a kli, as an opportunity for growth? The same way Abraham wanted old age as a way to give kavod to others, how is Israel a kli for us, an opportunity for growth as a nation, that we live in this time? And then we talked about the idea of searching for secrets. When someone seems like a stranger, how can we flip them from a stranger to someone who's filled with secrets for us? That's it. All right. I don't. If anyone has questions or comments, I'm interested in hearing them. Yes, thank you. So Kli, literally, thank you for asking, is literally a vessel. I think I'm like projecting onto vessel instrument, if that makes sense. And I think Kli is, like a musical instrument, is also a Kli. So it's an instrument. Oh, I'm sorry, it's a Hebrew term. Thank you. Thanks for the clarifying question. Yeah, please. And say your names, I'm sorry. What was your name? Nice to meet you. Okay. Yes. I love when people ask questions of things that I want to say, but I'm trying to save time. So you got me to say it now. So as I understand it, I'm learning the same we're all learning, is Abraham is chesed. His wife Sarah is yira. Okay? You can imagine Sarah. She's like, Yishmael has to go. That's a yira statement, right? It's just like, this is not working. We know what needs to happen. He needs to be out of the house. That's Abraham and Sarah. And then we get to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is yira, is awe that Yitzchak gets from his mother Sarah. And Yitzchak is married to Rivka, Rebecca. And Rebecca is chesed, right? Rebecca is the Abraham chain, right? Abraham sends Eliezer to find someone like him, who's Rebecca, the person that sits and waters all the camels, right? Because Rebecca is chesed. And then we have Yaakov, who's emet. And so Yaakov, of course, because he's all about juggling both sides. Abraham is married to Leah, who is yira, and also Rachel, who is chesed. He's married to both sides of the coin, if that makes sense. Cool, yeah. I know. Not mine. Just repeating other people's Torah, but yeah. Anyway. Yes. My Ranger fan. What's your first name? Hey, John. Thank you for the question. So I'll say a few things on that, and I won't pretend to be an expert on what's happening on campuses, but I like just from hearing from colleagues and a little bit at Hartman, I have a little bit of a sense. I'll say a few things. The first is, so Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, when he talks about these midot, he says that each person has one at their core. He basically lays out that your job is identify it, work on it, get really good at it, perfect it. If you do all those things, start taking on the other ones. Right? And I think we live in a mindset often where it's like, I'm meant to be good at everything. And I think Rabbi Dessler is really pushing people to lean into who they are. And I think one of the big challenges of today, before we even get into politics, is this pressure from people to be like other people, and not empowering our children and our students to think about like, no, deeply be you. Your job is not to be someone else. Your job is to deeply be you. And when people come after you for not being like them, can you hold your ground and be yourself? I'm not talking about politics there. I'm just talking about how character traits show up there. The second thing I want to say is that I think a mistake that we've made in our, let's call it pre-college education, is this sense that we have to turn everyone into a warrior for advocacy on campus. Our job is to teach them the lines to say to fight for Israel, which we don't do about other parts of Judaism. You know, like I was taught how to care about tefillah at Salman Schechter in New Jersey, and I wasn't taught like you need the talking points for convincing everyone in your dorm why God exists and why tefillah. And the reason I say that is it goes back to the same idea. Not everyone's meant to be an advocate. We need the people who want to be advocates to be given the tools and the focus and the strength. I'd rather, instead of having tons of resources on thousands of people, I'd rather pick the 20 out of 1,000 who really have the skills and the interest in being an advocate and train them to be amazing, and let the others lean into just like having a complex, meaningful, nuanced relationship with Israel that informs their identity but doesn't come with a responsibility to be an advocate. Because it's not everyone's responsibility. We talked about gifts to be an advocate. That's not their skill set necessarily. I think that's an important distinction to make as we think about people on campus. And then I'll say on the larger question of what does it mean to, let's say, I'll just call it like be a liberal Jew who is committed to Israel in a world where your commitment to Israel doesn't work with the rest of liberal values, let's say. So I think that's a harder question. I'll say that our experience at Hartman was as follows. We had, I helped lead a program in 2020 for teens. We had 250 teens join us that summer. And what we heard from them was what you said, which was a lot of them said, I'm a liberal Jew at my high school. I'm a liberal Jew about to go to college, and there's no way for me to fit in. And I think what they took away from us was not a simple, listen to this and everything will be fixed, but was a way for them to have a space to have hard conversations about Israel that was not, Israel wasn't at stake. It was a space for them to actually have those identity-forming conversations, notice what are hard questions about Israel, and notice how we might talk about them as a way to strengthen their foundation around how they think about those questions. Again, it doesn't necessarily solve the core question, which is like, how do you show up in that space? But I think that's a step in that direction, let's say. And then if we're going to be political, which I'm not, that's not like my skill set, I would say like we also made mistakes around like who are the key partners to have? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about truth and ideas. It's about like, you know, APAC does this well, spending time developing relationships with people so that like when people decide there's going to be a new movement, they don't view Judaism as outside of it, but they move it as inside. But that's a, again, certain people need to do that, not every teen, but that's a larger question. That's it. I hope there's something there yet. Okay, great. Let's go Rangers, most important. Okay, great. All right. Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much. Okay.
So thank you, Emily. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Gila. I just want to mention that we're having another program in February on the 28th. It's a Lunch and Learn, and it's going to be hosted by Temple Isaiah. And for something totally different and yet connected to the last question, Dr. I think her Rabbi, what's her? Yeah, but she's also, anyway, Michal Biton is this amazing scholar that some of you have learned with at Hartman or in Boston area before. Justin is new to me. Anyway, her topic is going to be, which I think flows from Jonathan's question, do American Jews have an ethical commitment to Israel? She's going to explore the concept of ne'emanut, which literally means loyalty or faithfulness. And I love the questions. Does this Jewish principle mean that we have ethical commitments based on the fact of relationship? This question can be challenging enough in the case of our obligations to family members. Does it also imply or require a steadfastness in our commitments toward Israel that is not dependent on specific policies or attributes? So I think it'll be a fascinating luncheon, and it's more information is coming out in both Amuna and Isaiah's websites. And it's the same link that you signed up for tonight. You can sign up for Michal, so we know you're coming. And thank you all for coming, and good night. Laila Tov. Drive safely.